morning. So it's great to be with you. And I'm not going to inspire you like Heather did, and I'm not going to entertain you like Rory did. Today, I suppose I'm going to appeal to your inner nerd, that part of you that kind of joins dots and enjoys a few insights. And I'm going to share some stuff with you, and kind of do with it as you will, because like at the outset, when I went through this deck, which is the result of several years of different pieces of research and observation. There was no kind of key that's the moment, that's the thing we need to land with this audience. What struck me was that there are so many different dynamics, and wouldn't it be great if you had different scenarios you needed to test, and if you had a kind of a quick, cost efficient way to test all those scenarios. So that was the one thing that stuck out for me. But I'm going to share all that stuff with you, and I'd love to get your questions. Before I start with that, Heather, that was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I'd love to talk to you afterwards. No, it was really, really good. And as I recall, when I was in Tesco, the people pushing the trolleys were 60% female. Yeah, so it wasn't as polarized as you might think, but it was definitely an over-index in female decision makers in terms of what was getting pulled off the shelf and into the trolley. That was really interesting. I'll talk to you after. Okay, so. I wear a couple of different hats. I've been working for myself for a few years after a career in retail, starting as a food scientist and then moving into buying and marketing, etc. One of the hats I wear is with IPLC, International Private Label Consulting. We're like a boutique group of 10 consultants with a presence in 12 countries around Europe. We're either ex-retailers like me or ex- suppliers like most of you, but with a common denominator in that we know quite a bit about private label, and it's different. It's quite a bit different from the branded FMCG world, and it's also more and more relevant as well. So do a little quick show of hands now. How many of you work for businesses that are supplying any private label? So some of you, but not many of you. And how many of you are actually supplying discounters? Okay, so a few more as well. So there's a whole chunk of the room who actually isn't in the private label world, and who actually isn't supplying the discounters who are the main proponents of private label. So hopefully this will be interesting and provocative for you. I'm going to talk about pricing, I'm going to talk about innovation, I'm going to talk about margin mitigation, and that's where you can get inside the head of the buyer in me. I've worked for lots of different retailers. I'm strategy consulting now. I do negotiation skills training. I do category management training, and we provide peer networks as well. All of my experience is in retail. IPLC as a boutique consultancy was founded in 2003 by a Dutch colleague, Koen de Jong, who had a history working for manufacturers, first of all branded manufacturers and then private label manufacturers. And when he came out of his corporate roles, he decided that he'd set up a consultancy for private label because it was different and it was growing. And we've got such a broad variety of clients. Most of them are manufacturers. Some of them are dual trackers that have a brand and private label. Some of them are retailers as well, like Carrefour, like Jumbo, like Silpo. And we work with them. Coincidentally, we generally have about one big retail project every year, and they'll engage us on the basis of, hey, we need your help on a private label strategy project, but it ends up being a much bigger kind of strategy project because private label doesn't live on its own. It obviously, it's part of a big machine that interacts with brands and shoppers and sourcing, etc. It's so much bigger than that, and that's the kind of stuff we get involved in. For this morning, then, I'm going to set a wee bit of context. I'm going to then share with you the summarized version of three successive research exercises. I'm going to bring that together and say, well, what does that mean for this year? Because again, we're in the world of FMCG, which should be VFMCG because it's so dynamic. And there's lots of stuff that's not captured within this that's happening right now that it would be really useful to get out on the table into the room, some themes and dynamics that are emerging. And then I'll identify a few themes that may or may not be relevant to all of you. One of them will be relevant to all of you. So the context then. In a local market context, we've got 5 big retailers. It wasn't always like that. The big 3, you've got the Musgrave SuperValu ex-Superquinn, you've got Dunnes Stores, you've got Tesco, and for a lot of years they were able to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the fact that the discounters were emerging in the market. Discounters made a breakthrough, and when they actually started behaving more like brands, when they started actually directly communicating with shoppers in an empathetic tone, and the big retailers couldn't put their heads in the sand anymore. Lots of price activity, dropping prices, price matching, vouchering, all of that. And that's effectively when you kind of ended up in this kind of a bit of a stalemate. And it's really only the pandemic and the inflation crisis that's actually kind of shaken that up again. Because the big three all lost market share, but effectively stabilized. And the discounters, their phenomenal growth started to moderate, and now what we're seeing across Europe is that discounter growth is pretty much plateauing. And if discounter sales plateau or stall for about 3 years, you'll find that their new store opening pipeline starts to kind of trickle and turn off, because there are stores in the pipeline that will have gone through a planning process 2-3 years ago, and it takes that long to get them opened. And if you stop growing sales, then you're probably going to keep on opening those stores. And that's what we're seeing. The rate of store openings for discounters is really dramatically declining, coming to a halt. Discounter growth all around Europe is coming to a halt. And the multiple retailers appear to have kind of demonstrated an ability to get an understanding of how they can compete, not just toe-to-toe on prices on 1,000 items, but actually with a differentiated offer where value isn't just about price. And I'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. But that's the local market context. Behind all of that, then, there's lots of cost context, which is the kind of thing that impacts how you sell to these retail customers. So you had a period of deflation, effectively from 2011, where most kind of food commodities globally were getting cheaper. And so you had a whole generation of buyers that worked for retailers who never took a cost increase, like 10 years of cost decreases in one shape or another. And then you had a pandemic and a period of inflation based on global supply chain interruptions, and everybody thought that would settle down in 2022, would get back to some normality. And then the Russians went across the border in Ukraine, and there was another level of volatility and crazy situations whereby the price of food commodities went up by 74% in that 2 or 3 year period. And if you look at different data sources, the price of groceries around Europe now are about 30% more than they were pre-pandemic, 2019, 2020. So we're all paying for this, and we know it. And that's the kind of the back story to it. Commodities have come down a bit, and then interestingly, they've started to tick back up again for various reasons. And the challenge for suppliers, whether you're in a brand or a private label or both, is that to get the CPIs that you did over the last couple of years, you had to kind of invite them inside your business a little bit and show them an element of your P&L to justify those cost increases somewhat. So they're now kind of bluffers stroke experts at commodities and cost dynamics. And so they're going to use all of those arguments that you used to get a cost increase against you when they're looking for cost decreases. But we're in a kind of a funny period now where some of the costs are going back up again. We'll talk about that afterwards. And it was really difficult to navigate. If you compare this all to back in 2008-9 global recession, there was exchange rate dynamics, there was global food commodity spikes, there was lots of CPIs that kind of flowed through into the industry. And they flowed through with relative ease because the retailers didn't really care about cost prices or retail prices. They were just very focused on rebates. And as long as you were hitting their rebate targets, then all of that inflation could flow through. But this time around, in the last couple of years, it was really hard because you had lots of retailers who were much more laser focused on competing with discounters. Private label was a much bigger part of their world. There was lots of item level price matching, and therefore it was just really hard to get those cost increases, especially when you had buyers who'd never taken a cost increase for 10 years. You had a range dynamic whereby if you think about a big multiple supermarket with 20 or 30,000 products, there's about 400 items right in the center of the bullseye there that nearly everybody buys nearly every week. And that's where all the price matching happens. And it could be 800 if depending on how strict you want it to be. And there's another 1,000 products around that, again, that nearly everybody buys nearly every week. And there's you can price match, but maybe there's a wee bit of room to maneuver, but not much. And then there's the other 20 or 30,000 products around there where there's a lot of freedom, but there isn't a whole pile of volume. So you've got this polarization of volume and value, where so much of the action goes on in here, and this really influences what goes on in the rest of the store. Because if the weather is funny and chilly, and there's a hailstone problem, and the grape harvest gets screwed for a fortnight, it's going to cost Tesco in Ireland 250k a week. That's how enormous these things are. And then you know how retailers are with their margins. They have to protect them really closely, and they'll go to all the other categories to try and find some margin mitigation solutions. And that's when it becomes really relevant to you. Like, well, what the hell have private label grapes got to do with us? Well, they have to margin mitigate, and I'll show you a little bit about how that works afterwards. The research that we did in 2022 was, well, how do you survive as a private label supplier? How do you negotiate with retailers when it's really hard? In 2023, it was about observing this evolving balance of power where retailers started to realize that they couldn't assume that they could beat up suppliers and tell them to go away when they were looking for CPIs. In fact, they couldn't get availability, so there was gaps on shelves, and that kind of rebalanced that dynamic, that balance of power. And suppliers started to realize that and work with that. There was a complete change in the tone of voice in those relationships. And then in 2024, we said, well, okay, how did it impact the suppliers? How did it impact the relationship between suppliers and retailers? And how has it impacted shoppers? So what happened actually to the prices, and how are shoppers behaving? And how has it impacted the range on the shelf? So they're the three exercises that I'm going to show you a few bits, some of the most pertinent points then that we learned from that. Just on the balance of power, I won't deal with the whole how do you negotiate with retailers thing from 2022 into the 2023 stuff. The evolving balance of power effectively meant that if you were a buyer or a commercial director, they called it a tsunami of cost increases coming across the table, and most of them were valid, but it didn't make it any easier. But there was a thought process within the retailers around, if you're gouging, I might have to give you this cost increase now, but I'm going to get you later. I'll wait in the long grass. So there is still that sense of, were all of the cost increases valid? Suppliers did become brave, though, because they realized that availability and security of supply was the most important thing for retailers rather than the lowest price. And they couldn't assume that the availability would be there. How did that reflect itself? Well, we talked to about 200 companies all around Europe, including some retailers, about 20 retailers, about 180 suppliers, and this is what they told us then, that retailers were actively demonstrating that they needed a sustainably profitable supply base. 69% agreed with that. And I mean, that would have been unheard of. The retailers didn't care if you were making money. They just wanted you to keep on supplying. They were communicating much more openly. They were much more collaborative in their problem solving. And there was a sense that for a private label company that they had a lot more a lot more power in 2023 than they did in 2019. A lot less confrontational. So when retailers are under pressure, they'll work with you. What did they do with all of these CPIs? Well, most of it just got passed on. 63% of the companies we talked to said that those cost increases were just passed on directly to customers. But that other 37% means that those CPIs were either pushed back or they were mitigated within the overall business. So you could take a cost increase on grapes, but give a retail increase in somewhere in health and beauty. And that's how retailers operate. They're always mitigating margins and moving things around. It affected the retailer buying strategies, though. They were leveraging their volumes where they had the benefit of high volumes. They were using them either to consolidate supply or split supply. They were playing with contract lengths. You've got retailers now doing 5-year deals with suppliers, especially if they're a private label supplier with a strategic partnership for a particular category. 3 years, 5 years, 7-year deals sometimes, because it's the only way that, like, retailers are really demanding, and they're ever more complex. Like, they want the cheapest product, the highest quality, an ethical supply chain, a traceable supply chain. They want a load of innovation coming through as well. They want the insights so that they can target shoppers effectively. They're really, really demanding. And to be able to do that and still be profitable and invest in your business as a supplier, you need some security in that relationship, and that's where this negotiations are resulting in these long 5-year, 7-year supply deals. And when we talk to those suppliers or those companies, 50% of them had an open book, multi-year collaborative partnership in place already with at least one of their customers. So it wasn't how they were doing all of their business, but it was how they were doing some of their business. Vertical integration, depending on where you're sitting, if your business is in decline and then your factories are going to suffer, you see that with companies like Morrison. But then you can also see some great examples of how vertical integration is working for retailers like the Schwartz Group, who are Lidl effectively and Kaufland, and that they own their own coffee factory, their own cocoa factory. They bought a paper mill because obviously they buy loads of packaging. They bought their own cybersecurity company. At one stage, they had 4 of those kind of big shipping ships for going around to the Far East. I think they've sold them since. But they had and they put solar panels on all of their roofs everywhere. So now they're kind of, to some extent, energy independent. So vertical integration for these businesses is really one of their most effective strategies. When we polled all of those suppliers, we selected a few of them, maybe a half a dozen companies, to get into a more intimate environment. And we did an exercise called a horizon scan. And effectively what we identified was the things that were going to keep them awake at night for the next couple of years. So up to 2030, we kind of said, well, what is it that's going to be the major challenges? Number one was managing volatility, because again, how many years have we had in the last 5 where you think it can't get madder than this, and next year it'll all settle down, and it flipping doesn't. And so in that scenario then, managing cost volatility, recovering those through the CPIs, reducing risk where you can, that's where companies are giving a lot of thought, managing volatility. Staying competitive, because it's okay if you can get a CPI if all of your peers are looking for the same CPI, but they're not, and businesses are doing things differently. Some are having a long-term view, some are having a very short-term view. So maintaining your competitiveness, finding and keeping people is a real competitive territory. Creating growth within all of that. Satisfying your sustainability targets and finding the correct balance of doing the things that retailers want you to do, but doing the things that are actually going to make a difference to your carbon footprint or your overall sustainability strategy. And then digital transformation. Just so many companies knowing that I know I can use technology to do a better job and to be more efficient, to share information and communicate within the organization and with my customers more effectively, but still doing loads of stuff on paper. So those are the 6 things that they identified, some of which are really, really relevant, I think, in this room, given the current context. Moving on to the price research that we did, we selected a trolley of goods, about 70 items, across all the different categories, including non-food, food, frozen, ambient, fresh. And we did a price survey, and we made sure that we had a brand, an equivalent mid-tier private label, a premium version of that, and a value version of that. So we've got all of those kind of 4 reference points for those 70 products, and we did that in 12 countries around Europe. And so what you've got here is the aggregated data. The things of interest to me, we did it back in 2016. The gap changed between then and 2021 in that mid-tier private label in a multiple supermarket was much more closely aligned to the discounter pricing. And that should be no major surprise. The index went from 146 down to 118 there. The difference between the discounter and the A brand effectively widened. If Lidl's prices were 100, it went from 217 to 222 for the brand. The big difference between then and 2024, last year when we checked it, was that the indices didn't change that much. For a Lidl at 100, for the private label in the multiples at 115, not massively different from 118, and the A brands at 217. Even with all of that inflation, the indices stayed the same. So everything kind of moved up to the same extent. But the big thing that we noticed was that the brand private label mix changed. And changed really, really quite significantly. So the amount of private label that shoppers were buying had changed, and a couple of indicators of that. This is 2021 versus 2023 across the core kind of European countries, and in every case, the percentage share of private label has increased. In Ireland, there, for example, it went from 43.3 up to 48, and so in every country it went up because shoppers were seeking value. They were seeking value during an inflation crisis, and if the prices went up by 30%, it didn't mean they were paying 30% more, because they were finding solutions. They were buying less for a start. Volumes actually went down even though the population grew. So can you imagine actually how much waste was stuff that was being bought and then wasn't being consumed? So that was part of the correction, and they were buying more private label. And if you were already a private label customer, you were buying more value private label. So different households had different kind of correction mechanisms, but that's generally what we saw. Discounter store openings were continuing apace during this period. And then they established kind of mainstream supermarkets had got much more serious about their private label ranges. They had given it more space, they had expanded the ranges, and there was a lot more price matching. If you look at the UK market, and how all of the big retailers now have an Aldi price match, like all of them, across at least 500 or 600 products. And that wasn't the case previously. So that's a good reason why private label would grow, and you can see the extent of it. Looking at standard tier private label, which is where most of the volume is, about 70 or 80% of the volume within private label is in the mid-tier, which is just your Tesco standard product, as opposed to your Tesco Finest or your Value or your farm brands. And different retailers across Europe take different approaches on this. And this is where I got to, which is I don't have a killer blow for you at the end of this presentation, because depending on the country and depending on the retailer that you're operating with, there are different scenarios, and which is why you're going to have a smart methodology for testing the different price and innovation strategies that you might bring to market. What we did observe generally, though, was that some retailers closely match the discounters, but they can only afford to do it on a narrow range because their cost base is different, like massively different. Other retailers match the discounters across a broader range, but it's kind of loose price matching. It's not toe to toe. I know 10 years ago when I left Tesco, we price checked Aldi twice a week, and we had to react within 24 hours if one of the items was out by a cent. And we had to drop the price. That was just it. It was the price policy. And that's another thing that we need to kind of keep in mind, which is that you can have very, very smart price strategies, but if the computer says no within the retailer, you might not be able to actually implement them because the price policy doesn't allow you to. What we've also observed is the development and the deployment of value tier. And I'll give you a reminder of where the value tier has come from and then show you where it's gone to. So we're talking about the cheapest items on display. And then loyalty schemes as well. And I'll share a couple of examples with you on that, because it's not just about price. And multiple retailers at last look like they've developed a bit of confidence around doing things that are differentiated and using their loyalty schemes to do that. But if you look at across Europe, then the price difference between standard tier private label in the supermarkets versus the discounters private label in Lidl is quite different depending on the country and the retailer. We talked about value, the value proposition, and mainstream retailers getting confident about doing things differently. I won't sweat this too much, but the couple of examples that I point to here are in Finland, where you've got two main retailers, and you've got a strong Lidl business, but actually the retailers are using their loyalty cards to do some quite innovative stuff. So you go shopping, you use your loyalty card, but actually they market it. One of them markets the points that you can get back. You can get them back as cash, so you can get a second payday. That's what they call it. So you get paid once a month by your employer, and then you get paid a second time by the retailer. So they're finding really interesting ways to grow loyalty. And it's not just the multiples that are doing it, because Lidl have done a really good job of the Lidl Plus app. Back on value tier then, how cheap is it compared to the standard tier? Because this we saw was an emerging competitive territory, which effectively had been moved away from. When I was commercial director for fresh foods in Tesco during the turnaround, I got rid of Tesco Value completely. Like, it just didn't exist on the shelves, and I used the mid-tier to match Aldi. But you can see these value tier products coming back into the ranges. SKU counts 2024 versus 2021, the range had expanded by 34% across the retailers that we observed. And all of them had rebranded and made it look much better and relaunched their value tiers. The prices had increased by 36% on value tier versus standard tier private label going up at 31% and brands going up at 27%, probably because they were coming from much further behind because nobody was making any money on the value products. But this is where it came from. That's how crap it looked when it was launched. And even the redesign in 2012, it still looked pretty rubbish. But this is what private label value tier looks like now across Europe. It looks really smart. And the products are good. And they have a personality. And they're appealing. So you can understand why shoppers that are under pressure would trust them and buy into them. But if you're going to sell a lot of value tier, which is necessarily going to make less money for both the manufacturer and the retailer, you have to mitigate that. And that's where I wanted to kind of take the presentation next, into margin mitigation and the role of brands and the role of premium private label as a brand. The indices are interesting here. We found that premium private label across all these retailers is 79% more expensive than the mid-tier private label. And the average comparable brand, if the index to mid-tier was 179, the brands were at 217, and value private label was at 72. So that's just to give you a feel for those kind of price hierarchies and differences across Europe. But if you're going to sell a lot more of this value stuff, drive volume and lower margin and affect your mix, then you have to do more of this stuff here as a retailer. And if you're a private label operator, you can't just do mid-tier and entry level. And if you're one of those dual trackers that has a brand as well, then more and more of you are discovering that there's a place for your brand in the discounters. And we polled this, actually. We had an open discussion at our seminar last year in Amsterdam. And a lot of people kind of were saying, yeah, the discounters like to stock the big brands because it's customer focused. It proves that they're listening to the shoppers. But for years they didn't, and they were able to copy and actually better a lot of the specifications of the A brands that were on shelf. So they were happy not to for a long time. And then there was another school of thought, which was the discounters want to stock the big A brands because they're so expensive that it makes their mid-tier look even better value. So they position them beside each other. My thesis on it is that it's just about margin mitigation. And I'll give you an example of what that means. Commercial mitigation. This is an example that I drew from Aldi last year when I did a quick price check. I was looking at pasta sauce, ambient pasta sauce. I counted the number of SKUs, looked at the retail price, the pack size, estimated the rate of sale in units per store per week, estimated the margins based on my personal experience. There's no insider, 10-year-old insider knowledge. So, well, how does that balance out in terms of a weighted kind of subcategory margin? And basically, you've got the value tier, which is making nothing. You've got the mid-tier private label doing all of the heavy lifting. You've got then a premium private label, which makes really, really strong margins. But this brand that sits in here, we might only have one SKU, but it's actually a significant part of the gross margin. It's actually the biggest part of the gross margin contribution across these 4 tiers of products. So you can't do this stuff here. You can't sell the cheaper stuff without having some of the more expensive stuff. And that's even in a limited range discounter who only has 1,500 or 2,000 SKUs. That's the kind of thinking that they need and they're actively working to. So that's just to bring that to life a little bit for you. One of the other things that we were was very topical was that if you're a retailer and you're really hard to negotiate with, and you don't like taking cost increases, and you're so focused on margin, and you think, well, why are they so focused on margin? They make loads of money. Well, they do, because they're heavily scaled businesses. But just based on the annual reports that were released, I had a look at the retailer operating margins by year for some of the big ones globally, and they all make about 3.5% operating margin, which is not enormous, but they're enormous businesses. That's how it makes sense. But that's why they're so defensive of their margin. If they're taking a cost increase, they need to be sure about how they're going to mitigate it. Are they going to pass it on to shoppers or find the solutions somewhere else? And there isn't any big evidence to suggest that they've been gouging it through this period. If anything, the retailers are looking at you guys and thinking some of yous are gouging it in terms of the cost increases that are being requested. Right, bringing it up to date then with 2025 dynamics. Again, everybody thought we're through the inflation crisis. Things are moderating. Food inflation, according to Kantar, had kind of settled out around 2% year on year, which was where it was back in 2019, 2020, etc., before things went bonkers. But we're actually seeing inflation kick back in again now for lots of different reasons, good reasons, minimum wage, how that trickles through an organisation, some commodity-driven stuff, and then some commodity and category-specific stuff, not just inflation, but kind of hyperinflation. Like the beef category in a supermarket is worth about 3% of all of their sales. Fresh beef, steaks, mince, burgers, all that. So it's about 3% of their sales. It's massive. And the price of beef has gone up by 90% in the last 5 years. So a farmer in Ireland taking an animal to a factory this morning to get the chop is getting paid 90% more for it. Now their costs have gone up as well, but that's had an impact globally. The herd size in the States is down at its lowest level since the 1950s. South American volumes aren't available to make up for all of that. Okay, so let's not buy beef. Let's buy more chicken. It's healthier anyway. But you can't do that because avian flu and environmental impacts, which mean that you have lower stocking densities legally. That means that the price of chicken and eggs has gone up, and that's all flowing down into pork. So there's nowhere to hide. There's huge inflation on some of these big categories, and there's no obvious way to mitigate it. And you've got retailers thinking, I can't pass on a 90% cost increase to the shoppers. So what are they doing? Well, they're passing some of it on right now as we speak, but they're going to other proteins. Plant-based actually has an opportunity now to kind of push ahead again. Fish actually, which became very expensive, now isn't quite so expensive. Value engineering, shrinkflation, all of those things are happening. But what I'm really, really curious about in the upcoming year, and what's really relevant, I think, to this room, is how retailers take a whopper of a cost increase on a big category like beef, and how that might show itself in a completely different category like breakfast cereals or health and beauty, because they have the capacity to do that. And if shoppers are less price sensitive over here and they can get a couple of percent out of them, then that means they don't have to pass as much of it on in the beef category. And if you're at commercial director level, you can kind of move all of these things around and hopefully you'll find a solution. But you don't do that carelessly, but it's something that's within your, it's definitely within your thought processes. And I've spoken to retailers over the last week, and this is kind of where their heads are going. New product development is a topic of discussion right now, because as private label grew and grew and grew, but became less and less profitable because of all the discounter matching, new product development was one of the key ways to actually boost some margin into your categories. But actually you've got a supply base that is looking at the NPD and thinking, that's actually not delivering a return for me. I've got massive investment in developing new products. They only want them because they're looking to win the next Great Taste Award or some other marketing purpose. And they're really questioning the return on the investment that they're putting into new product development. So again, that's another good reason why EPIC and conjoint testing would be very, very relevant here, so that you only let the innovation into your pipeline that has kind of nearly pre-proven itself. You can only work on the winners. I'll leave you just with some kind of broad themes then that are top of my mind as we move into the further through this year. Like it remains an ultra competitive and really dynamic sector. You don't know what's happening next. What we do, it's tariffs actually, and then what's after that. Managing margin mix for retailers really will always be that kind of magic that they're always doing. Managing the mix of private label and brands, and the mix within private label in terms of the tiers. But price is only one element of value, and their retailers are much more open to doing things that are different and not boxing themselves into a corner where they only operate on price. That value proposition, as those Finnish retailers have shown, they're open to ideas on that. So they're diversifying their value delivery. Discounters, their growth is definitely plateauing and is definitely under threat. What does that mean for you? Most of you aren't dealing with discounters, so you might be happy about that. But what it could mean, though, is that the discounters, their knee-jerk reaction to that will be, we're not opening more stores, we're not growing, so let's just drop prices. That could be one of the things that they do. Even if the cost environment isn't supporting it, they might take a very long view, as Aldi and Lidl can. And that could create some downward cost pressure on different categories. Still, retailers still need great supplier partners. They're willing to do long-term deals with them if it's collaborative, if it's private label driven, if it's customer driven. So they're interested in innovation, but suppliers, I suppose, need to be careful about what innovation they allow into their pipelines because it's costly. They're interested in anything that will differentiate them. They really need transparent and efficient supply chains. They need to work with their supply base on all of their sustainability promises, and they need innovative price strategies from the manufacturers and the brands that are supplying them. So there are some of the themes and some of the opportunities, I'm sure, which some are relevant to you wherever you're at in your evolution, whoever you're dealing with, or wherever you're dealing in Europe. So that's everything I wanted to share with you today. I'm on LinkedIn. I agree, it's a great place to do business. Connect with me if you're not already, and I'd love to have conversations on retail dynamics. And if any of you want any help on category management or training or negotiation skills, then don't hesitate to give me a shout. I'd love to take some questions before we go to our coffee break, if anybody has anything. No questions.
One of the costs for dealing with shelf-ready packaging for discounter was encountered by the producers. How do you see that moving forward?
The cost of shelf-ready packaging?
Yeah.
Again, it depends on the retailer. I can see that Aldi have just removed a lot of SRP, but then they've added a lot of in-store costs. So it depends. It could depend even just on something as simple as the price of paper going back into the market again. So I can't forecast what's going to happen there.
Malachy, your conversation with retailers, do they ever talk about NRM, or do they have an opinion of net revenue management and these sort of internal teams in the suppliers that are changing pack sizes? Like, what do you hear from the guys when you're in talking to them?
Well, on those two topics, then, when I'm talking to my ex-colleagues about what's going on in the marketplace, etc., there was two things that came up. They're really pissed off about shrinkflation because their shoppers are getting kind of really tired of it. And it's kind of it feels like it's at a tipping point, so that's one thing. But when I was talking to them about smart pricing strategies, research-based pricing strategies, they couldn't come to me with any kind of obvious example of where a brand had come to them with something different that was smart and would actually make them more profitable and could mitigate margin problems in another category, but actually wouldn't harm the rate of sale or the consumer response. So they couldn't point to an example. So that, I think, is a big opportunity area.
Can I ask a follow-on to that? Who are the buyers, or what sort of buyers are there that are best at getting price increases through in a retailer? So you obviously had buying team reporting into you, and supplier would come to them and go, whatever, costs are moving to X, Y, or Z, and you'd obviously tell them, get back in that room. Tell me about the guys who managed to, let's say, negotiate internally on behalf of their suppliers to get that cost through in the business. Because clearly, as you say, they've got to mitigate it somewhere else. So that buyer gets it through, but then someone else is going to have to wait for theirs. So any examples of, like, let's say, the sort of either that or the material the buyers came with to justify it to you?
Well, for me, it wasn't the differentiator wasn't necessarily the buyer. The differentiator was the supplier. So one supplier could rock up and demand a cost increase and not have any data behind it, or they could provide data which was easily neutralized. We haven't had a cost increase in 10 years and the cost of labor has gone up. And then you remember you visited their factory last year and it was a fully automated And if we take it back to 10 years, actually we should be looking for a cost decrease because that commodity has gone down. A lot of that stuff was really easy to neutralize. And when buyers became a wee bit more switched on, not ultra focused on rebates, but actually focused on the cost price of the product, that improved an awful lot. So the differentiator then was the quality of the account manager that was coming in, and their ability not to just negotiate with the buyer, but to enable the buyer to have that internal negotiation. I think you're bang on in terms of talking about how they have to have that internal negotiation, and the differentiator was the supplier. So are they able to look at that buyer as nearly as an ambassador for whatever message they're landing with the buyer, enabling the buyer to land that message internally. But what it did come down to an awful lot of the time, Andy, was if you don't pay the price, you can't have the product.
So love the presentation. When you just look like retail, it's very interesting. So 2 caveats before I ask you a question. I know it's super VUCA at the moment, the world we live in, and I know costs are escalating and each retail is very different. But the whole growth challenge is very interesting in the sense that actually through your presentation and the whole mood music is very much not focused on volume in a lot of the talk, and you yourself saying it's very difficult, increasingly difficult to put down new stores. All this. So from your conversations, where's the headspace on footfall growth and volume, as well as obviously price lever for the future?
Okay, so
Big question, I know.
it is a big question, and it's quite simple though, in that retailers don't think much beyond the next 6 months or 12 months. And the buyers that you might be dealing with, category managers, even the senior category managers, they're not really tuned into store openings. They're just so focused on their category and dealing with the day-to-day challenges and just getting through it. They're getting through that tsunami of cost increases, which is crisis management. So they're not thinking especially strategically. With the benefit of knowing how retailers think, but being out of them for the last 10 years nearly, what I can see is that where you're going to get growth from, population will continue to grow kind of organically, but also population movement is going to be a factor driven by climate change. So one of my pals is the ex-head of sustainable sourcing in Tesco, happens to live in Bantry now, married to an Irish girl, and he was quoting some figures to me, the forecasted Irish population of 10 million by 2050, you know, but it'll be a much more diverse population, and they won't necessarily be interested in the flavours that we're interested in now. Islam is the fastest growing religion in Ireland. Polonaise is a chain that catered to all those Eastern Europeans. So they have about 30 stores in Ireland. You look back at those, stand and look at those shops, you know they're turning over about 50k a week, multiplied by 30 shops, multiplied by 52 weeks in a year. That's a business of some significance, and they're rebranding and premiumising their stores at the moment. And there's a whole world of ethnic stores that could yet come underneath a banner from a selling and from a procurement point of view. And there's going to be growth there, for sure. There's definitely going to be growth there. Population will grow, and my view is there's room for them.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I love, and I want to answer. Value creation comes from volume growth, and if the volume growth is good, then you can decrease your margin and you still make money.
Mm-hmm.
When there is no volume growth, the margin mix is the more important one, and I loved when you showed the mix of that Dolmio versus the others, and Dolmio sold 36 pieces to make the same amount of money net versus 140, their own premium brand. And I said, wow, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody says, give me lower price on Dolmio versus how can I sell more Dolmios in pieces?
Yeah.
And I need to reframe that.
That I think is, you can't argue with that logic. That's the truth. That's what the numbers show you. Not all the buyers will be switched on to that. The buyers can say, well, your product is too expensive. And your response could be, yeah, you need it to be more expensive to mitigate all that other stuff that you're selling at zero margin or below margin. And below cost selling actually is a topic that's, I believe, is kind of rumbling in Europe now from a legal point of view. But we changed the law in Ireland in 2006. The ban on below cost selling was lifted, and coincidentally or not, that's when discounters really took off. And what does it do? It allows the market to really skew itself. Like shoppers are completely out of touch with the value of food and the effort that goes into producing food, and much more inclined to waste it as well as a result. So creating value and driving volume, and margin mix management, I think they're the key topics.
Malachy, thanks a million. Really enjoyed it. I was really interested in the yin and yang of 10 years of no CPIs and then the crisis of the last couple of years. As that potentially settles, who knows, I'm interested in your thoughts as a retailer on the sustainability of price through brands as a long-term lever for growth. And I think we're probably uncovering it here, but that muscle memory that we've built from a capability within RGM, how can that sustainably, maybe not as dramatically as we've seen the last couple of years, how would that sit with you as a retailer in terms of building that long-term growth partnership?
I think you have to approach with caution and take a fairly cautious, balanced view, because if your private label is a much bigger part of your business and it's much more exposed to these kind of commodity-based price changes, you can literally lose hundreds of thousands of euro on a product per week if something happens that outside of your control. You can't, to some extent, you can go to brands and less price-sensitive categories for your solutions, but you can't keep going there. And that's why I think branded manufacturers or dual tracking manufacturers have to really invest in knowing what the tipping points are. Yeah, you can come to this well once, but you can't come more than that. And if you go beyond that, then you'll suppress your volumes, and then you'll be making a high percentage of nothing then.
Okay, yeah, Tom?
On when thinking about kind of revenue managers and negotiations, I kind of try and encourage my guys where they can to get into customer meetings to better understand the dynamic. Having sat as a retailer, what's your perspective on having like revenue managers sat in customer meetings and negotiations and allowing that to take some of the heat maybe off of the account management team?
I think there's value in that. Yeah, I mean, when I'm teaching negotiation skills, we talk about the team that you field, but the team has to have a purpose. Because how many times was I in Tesco when there was 10 people on the Tesco side of the table, completely uncoordinated, having negotiations that were undermining themselves in front of a small supplier who they should have been able to have for breakfast, but the supplier just kind of had sat back and looked at them undermining each other. So if you're going to bring a team in, you have to field it properly. They have to be clear about what their views are, which also means that you need to train your MPD and your less customer-facing people. They need to have some training in negotiation skills and what to say and what not to say. It needs to be quite disciplined if you're going to bring them. But they can definitely add value, because you can tag team then. If the poor account manager's getting the crap beaten out of them, then you can divert it onto somebody else and you can take a breather.
It goes full circle as well in terms of that experience, that especially if you've got revenue managers that maybe haven't sat in sales or kind of very much on the front line.
Yeah.
It just helps that whole value circle close in terms of them understanding a bit more of the
Yeah.
dynamic of the sales.
Yeah, you're hearing it directly. Yeah. It's of value, but with caution.
Very, very tough one to manage, to keep your account manager empowered, though. You know what I mean? Like, if the second that person sits at the table, is like, because I've had it done to me. I remember with Nick Jones, once the buyer realised Nick Jones was coming, the eyes stopped looking at me and started looking at Nick Jones, because they realised that's the guy who's going to sign off this check. And he did sign off the check. I never did. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the challenge, isn't it? You've got to... They have to make the account manager more powerful, not less powerful.
Well, you mean definitely you would bring in your peers,
Yeah.
or your supporting team. You try as far as possible to never bring your boss in. That's like the grandparents are always easier on the kids.
Nick wants a micromanager. No, look what he's created. Anyway, right, we need to take a break there. Thanks very much, Malachy.
Pleasure.